There's a brand new Resident Evil series on Netflix. Does it respect the lore, and is it good? Let's talk about it. What is up, Netflix fans? Welcome back to my channel. Resident Evil is back for like the 7th, 8th, 9th time. But this time around, Netflix is taking it over and turning it into a series. We're going to discuss whether or not it works, but I need you all in the comments down below. First off, here's the summary. The year is 2036, 14 years after the spread of joy caused so much pain. Jade Wesker fights for survival in a world that is overrun by bloodthirsty, infected, and mind-shattering creatures. In this absolute carnage, Jade is haunted by her past in New Raccoon City, by her father's chilling connections to the sinister Umbrella Corporation, but mostly by what happened to her sister, Billie. So there are some very distinct timelines at play here. We'll get into that. First off, the rating for this series. Then I think this one is pretty obvious. TV mature, there's blood, gore, lots of action and violence, some cursing, everything that makes a show mature, so not for the youngins, unless they sneak and watch it, which is not something I advocate for. Resident Evil. Let's talk about the video games, the love, the admiration that so many fans across the board have for specifically the first three, but as you progress and the story gets bigger and the action gets more prevalent, something they've taken and factored into a lot of these adaptations. Obviously, we got the movie last year, and we have the Resident Evil films of the early 2000s spanning years and years, right? They were successful in their own way. I'm not the biggest fan of those movies, and really I haven't been the biggest fan of any of the adaptations so far. I'm not entirely sure why a studio hasn't taken that concept and replicated it, changing things along the way and obviously adapting it, modernizing it, but not making the story so different or so convoluted or whatever the early 2000s movies were that it becomes something separated from what fans wanted to see. Now, this series I was intrigued by, right? I enjoyed some of the casting choices. I didn't know exactly what route they were going to go, but when you have a series, there's more time to flesh things out. When you have a series, you have the opportunity to bring us multiple characters, and in this case, multiple timelines. But is Netflix able to execute? Because what this show is, it's a loose sequel to the video games. There's lore there. There are plenty of Easter eggs across the board that I feel like, even though they're few and far in between, I felt like they were well handled in this show, right? We are set in the future, obviously according to the summary, but there's also this timeline happening in 2022 where we're learning the build-up to this grand scale apocalypse. But if you go back further, since this is new Raccoon City, it is heavily hinted at that the old Raccoon City is something that did happen, at least the first three games, so a loose sequel, if you will. That's the show that we're getting, and that is an interesting concept in itself. But then we talk about the timeline that we tend to focus on more so in this show, and it's one that's a little further into the future where Jade is roaming this desolate world that inevitably got destroyed by this virus once again. And that's your big storyline, right? You talk about Resident Evil, the first thing I think of is horror, and that is what is so good about the original games. Feeling claustrophobic, walking through a hallway, having these demonic creatures popping out, man. That's what I think of when I think Resident Evil. Well, the future storyline, it's not that, right? It's a consistent series of action sequences with a character that we know because we're establishing her in the other timeline. But anytime she encounters someone, there's a group that's after her, really anyone that is with her in this future storyline, we just kind of pick up with them and we don't really know the backstory there. So I didn't care nearly as much about that storyline. I think she does a nice job as the character, but for the most part, I don't think of Resident Evil and think of the huge grand action sequences as much as I think of the horrific sequences that we get more of when we're flashing back to 2022 and these daughters are discovering what Umbrella is and what their father was up to. And even though some of that does feel a little bit CW-ish, the teen angst is definitely present in this show, and I feel like that took the moments that I was actually enjoying myself with, it started to take those down a notch because that is not necessarily what I was looking for in this series, and I don't know if it's what hardcore fans are going to be looking for in this series, but in terms of compelling characters and what they're actually, trying to figure out themselves, that part worked extremely well. The secrets that are being hidden by Lance Reddick's character in Albert Wesker. And I know there was a bit of an uproar online. Again, I've played the games, not super invested in the lore, but surface level wise, I know exactly what to expect from a show like this. Lance Reddick is amazing. Everything about him as an actor, but the gravitas that he has and adds to this character, which creates for an interesting storyline with his daughters. These are two characters in Billie and Jade that have a lot to them. And while I wasn't as into the dramatic side of things when it starts to go that route, their relationship is great. I love a good sister-brother dynamic in a show like this. You get that from these two characters, but what's happening with Billie, everyone's trying to figure this out and put the puzzle pieces together. Then you have Albert, who is both aware and unaware of what is happening behind the scenes. He has that shadiness to him, but Lance Reddick plays it in such a way, and if you don't recognize Lance Reddick, he has a long, storied career. You probably think of the John Wick movies first off, and I don't blame you. He's fantastic in those films, especially in the third one, but he brings it in this show. Anytime he's on screen, I thoroughly enjoyed myself, and anytime that storyline wasn't focusing as heavily on the overly dramatic aspects, and we're getting the zombie stuff, we're getting the creatures, and that's what worked for me about the show. The effects in this series. Netflix actually did a really nice job of bringing these creatures to life. I believe visually this series is way better than I expected just from watching the trailer, and those moments that bring about the intensity. I don't want to say they scared me, because once again, the horror is really not the focus. Even in this 2022 storyline, we get moments like that, but I was never scared. I was never on the edge of my seat in that way. It was more so the personal touches to this series, and even though that focus is kind of all over the place, when we get those scenes, it works extremely well. My issue is more so not finding the right tone with this show. Jumping from storyline to storyline, the stuff that was happening in the distant future, I just wasn't as on board for. It's this over-exaggerated apocalyptic situation, which sounds great. I mean, I think of Mad Max when I say something like that, but it's not that, because the characters, they just didn't do it for me. They were, completely either over the top or dull or somewhat lifeless. I'm not saying that about Jade. I think Jade is a rock-solid character, but when you don't put a lot around the person that we're following around, it just didn't feel as interesting for me, and everything's so grand scale in that storyline. I would rather them scale it back and just have those horrifying, haunting sequences, take advantage of the great special effects that you have in this show, but they were unable to do that, in my opinion. And then in the 2022 storyline, while that family dynamic worked so well, and like I said, Lance Reddick, his screen presence is top tier. It's top notch. The story was a bit all over the place, and I just couldn't get more invested in the future storyline, but even then I wasn't as emotional as I needed to be when we were focusing on anyone else but these three characters, right? And then it's just the idea of having such great source material in the palm of your hands, yet no one has been able to, or attempted to, replicate that. I mean, we've seen things get close before to replicating it, but the ones that have tried to replicate it, well, it didn't have the quality required to do it. I feel like this show, there are parts that are quality. I feel like if someone loved Resident Evil, took this and said, we're going to change things up, we're going to do something different, push into the future, bring new storylines, and all of that is great, but the focus has to be there. And I felt as if the show was just a bit too unfocused for its own good. And I've seen that post-apocalyptic thing before countless times. The Train to Busan sequel, that absolutely felt reminiscent to this. Both times, I was disappointed. Whereas on the other side of things, when it becomes more personal and small scale, that's when something like this works. And if it would have captured that horror, maybe I would be a bit more positive on this show. It gets close, but it never truly brought that home for me. Before I give you my score, what is your favorite Resident Evil project so far? Are you a fan of the games, this or that? Did you like this series? At its core, there is a lot that works, but the series may be too unfocused for its own good. One of the two major storylines isn't all that interesting, but the Wesker family is solid. Lance Reddick steals the show, but it may not be enough because of the lack of interest elsewhere. Some nice tension built, but going back and forth a bit too much. My score is a 50%. This one did not quite come together like I wanted it to. Good elements, great prosthetics, a cool creature design, but a story that just it was a bit back and forth, but that doesn't mean you have to feel the same way. What did you guys think? Let me know in that comments down below. I appreciate it, and I'll be seeing you soon.